It was a curious thing, the way people speak of death when they have no expectation of its arrival. They speak of it as though it were an inevitability, something to be faced with resignation, or perhaps with a stiff upper lip. But not Mr. Edward Yates. No, he made his declaration with the kind of certainty that one might reserve for a business transaction or a board meeting. "I shall die," he said, "at precisely midnight." I remember the first time I heard those words, delivered, not with the trembling voice of a dying man, but with a calmness that seemed almost theatrical. I had accompanied Poirot to St. Andrew's Hospital, as a faithful companion ought to do, and as we stood in the ward, I was struck not only by the peculiar atmosphere, but by the oddness of the patient himself. Yates was a wealthy man, as much known for his eccentricity as for his business dealings. He was one of those men whose name one hears mentioned in the corridors of power, but whose face one rarely sees in public. Yet here he was, sprawled on a hospital bed, his pale face framed by a tuft of white hair, his dark eyes flashing with a strange, almost theatrical intensity. "I shall die at midnight," he had repeated to Dr. Julian Motley, the attending physician. "No one can prevent it. It is inevitable." The good doctor, a man of solid credentials and a reputation for precision, smiled indulgently at Yates's wild pronouncement. "You are not perhaps feeling well, Mr. Yates. There is no need for such morbid talk. It is but a symptom of your condition. Rest assured we shall attend to it in good time." But Yates would not be silenced. "No, no, doctor, it is the truth." "I know it. Midnight, the hour of my departure." We, the few in the room, exchanged uncertain glances. Was it a case of delusion brought on by the feverish state he was in? Or was there something more, something which Yates was aware of, but which the rest of us could not grasp? Poirot, however, did not rush to judge the matter. He simply observed, his keen eyes fixed on Yates, with that air of quiet analysis he always carried. His presence, though unassuming, seemed to cause a shift in the room's atmosphere. Even Dr. Motley, the ever-rational man, seemed momentarily discomposed, but he quickly regained his professional composure. "A prediction," Poirot remarked, his voice light, but with that unmistakable undertone of a mind sharpening like a blade. "A curious thing, is it not, Hastings? How so many believe they can read the future. It is as though they have been privy to the secrets of time itself." "I would be more inclined to believe it was the delirium talking," I replied, though, even as I said it, I felt the oddness of the moment pressing in on me. Poirot turned to me with a smile that was both knowing and slightly amused. "Perhaps, my friend. But there is more to this, I suspect, more than simple sickness or imagination. Ah, the little grey cells," he said, tapping his forehead lightly. "They shall guide us. We will see what happens at midnight. At the time I thought it an overreaction. Surely Yates was merely a man overwhelmed by his affliction, his mind adding fantastical notions to an otherwise mundane illness. And yet, as the day wore on, the atmosphere in the hospital grew heavier. There was a sense of something building in the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. As night fell, Dr. Motley had taken his leave, assuring us that he would return shortly to check on Yates. The staff was at its usual efficiency, moving through the halls like clockwork, but even they were touched by a sort of nervous energy. I found myself wandering the corridors, trying to shake off the disquiet that had begun to settle over me. But then, just before midnight, an odd thing happened. We were in the lounge, Poirot and I, having a quiet conversation about the case, when we heard the commotion, a flurry of footsteps, shouting, and the unmistakable ring of urgency in the voices of the hospital staff. Poirot, ever alert, was on his feet in an instant. "Come, Hastings," he said, his voice suddenly firm. "It is time." We arrived at Yates' room within moments, and there, in the dim light of the hospital, we found the man. He was lying on the bed, his eyes wide open, staring as though fixed on some point beyond the room. His face was drained of colour, his lips slightly parted, as though the breath had been drawn from him the instant the clock had struck the hour. It was the most peculiar thing. The clock on the wall had just struck midnight, and yet here he was, dead, his body stiffening, as though frozen in time. I took a step closer, almost unwilling to believe it. "He's gone," I whispered. Poirot, ever the composed investigator, stood still for a moment. He did not move to examine the body immediately. Instead, his sharp eyes took in the room with their usual precision. He observed the details. The pale light from the street lamps filtering through the curtains, the quiet ticking of the clock, the stillness of the room that was so different from the chaos outside it. And then, with a soft exhale, he turned to me. "It is as I suspected, mon ami. Mr. Yates knew more than we did, yes? But there is something more to this death, something beyond mere prediction." We were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Motley, his face pale and his hands trembling as he stepped into the room. "I don't understand," he said, his voice shaky. How could this have happened? He was fine just hours ago." Poirot turned to the doctor, his expression inscrutable. "Ah, you see, Doctor, you may have dismissed his words, but I believe Mr. Yates was trying to tell us something." I glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the tension in the air. There was a small envelope on the nightstand, its edges worn as though it had been handled several times. It was addressed simply in a careful, almost elegant script to someone who will understand. I approached the envelope, my curiosity piqued, but Poirot gently placed his hand on mine, stopping me before I could open it. "No, no, Hastings," he said quietly. "Not yet. The time will come for that. But for now we must allow the mystery to unfold at its own pace." The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock and the distant sound of the hospital staff moving about, unaware of the tragedy that had just taken place. A mystery had begun, one that would demand all of Poirot's famous skill to unravel. As I looked at the envelope, I could not shake the feeling that we had just stepped into something far more intricate than I could have ever anticipated. And as I turned to follow Poirot out of the room, I wondered just how much did Edward Yates truly know, and why had he been so certain of his own death? The answers, I was sure, would not come easily. But Poirot was already thinking, his little grey cells already working their magic, and I, for one, was eager to follow. The air in St. Andrew's Hospital, a place so often associated with healing and recovery, seemed oddly charged that afternoon. It was as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. What, precisely, no one could say. Poirot, ever the perceptive observer, seemed to sense it even more acutely than I did, his small frame standing as still as a statue in the corner of the room. There was nothing overt in his manner, no outward sign of agitation, yet I could see the sharp glint in his eyes, the steady way in which he scanned every face, every corner, every flicker of emotion. "Poirot," I ventured quietly, leaning closer to him, "what do you make of all this?" He turned to me with a small smile, his hands folded neatly before him. "Ah, mon ami, I make nothing as yet. But there is much to see, much to consider." We stood just outside Yates' private room, the faint murmur of voices drifting down. The hall, as staff and visitors alike continued their duties, a nurse passed by, her steps hurried, and her eyes averted. I could not help but notice how many of the staff seemed anxious, avoiding direct eye contact, shifting uncomfortably, as though they feared being watched. There was something strange about this place, something that had not been there before. And then there was Dr. Motley. The man had been a model of professional detachment earlier, but now I caught sight of him in the corridor, walking briskly with his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his eyes darting as though seeking some escape from his own thoughts. A slight tremor had taken residence in his hand as he passed us, and I could swear I heard him mutter something under his breath, though what it was I could not make out. Poirot was not one to let such things go unnoticed. He nodded slightly as though confirming something to himself. "You observe, Hastings," he murmured. "A man so sure of his own mastery over life and death, yet troubled by something. A shadow lingers over him. It is not merely the death of Yates that weighs on him." "Do you think Dr. Motley knows more than he's letting on?" I asked, although I felt the answer was obvious enough. There was something in the doctor's demeanour that didn't sit right. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "One cannot help but wonder, mon ami, but it is too early to say. Let us look further, yes? Let us look at the others." As we stepped away from Yates' room, Poirot's gaze swept the hallway. His attention flicked to a group gathered near. The window, a tall, striking woman in her mid-40s, her face drawn with weariness, yet unmistakably proud. A man beside her, young, perhaps in his late 20s, dark hair slicked back in a manner that struck me as somewhat too deliberate. The woman I recognized immediately from the photos I had seen in the newspapers, Mrs. Clarissa Yates, the widow. The man was her son, Michael, whose wild behavior had often been a subject of gossip. At the sight of us, Mrs. Yates stiffened imperceptibly, her eyes narrowing, and for a moment I thought I saw her lips twitch into a faint, uneasy smile. Her son Michael, though, did not seem to notice our approach, his eyes fixed on the floor, as though preoccupied with his own thoughts. Poirot seemed to detect something in this exchange, something I had missed entirely. His eyes were fixed on the young man, Michael, but he did not speak immediately. Instead, he took a few slow steps, drawing nearer before turning his gaze back to me. "Ah, Hastings," he said softly. "Observe the young man. The way he stands, hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. It is as though he is trying to hide himself. And his mother, how her eyes flicker between him and the rest of the world. There is a tension there, a connection, but one of secrecy, I think." "Do you think they know something we don't?" I asked, suddenly uneasy. Poirot gave a slight shake of his head. "Not yet, my friend, but I suspect there is more to this family than meets the eye. There is a history here. It is not yet clear to me, but I am certain that this young man holds more answers than he realizes. But let us move on for now." We continued to walk the corridors, and though my mind was still occupied with the strange behavior of the Yates family, Poirot seemed focused on something else entirely. His gaze, which had been so intent on the people around him, now shifted to the room itself. As we passed Yates' bed, the faint scent of perfume lingered in the air, a delicate floral fragrance that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of a hospital room. Poirot paused, turning to look at the bed where Yates had lain just hours ago. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly and his nostrils flared as if he were sniffing out a hidden trail. "Do you smell it, Hastings?" he asked quietly. I took a deep breath and caught the faintest trace of the scent, soft, sweet, and distinctly foreign. My mind raced as I tried to place it, but I was not certain. "That's unusual, isn't it?" I asked, glancing around the room. There was no sign of anyone else having been in the room recently, other than Dr. Motley and the hospital staff. Could it be a visitor's scent? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the nightstand beside the bed, inspecting the small details, the empty glass of water, the crumpled tissue on the floor, the faint marks on the linen sheets. His hand brushed over the nightstand lightly, as though conducting a search without disturbing anything unnecessarily. "I believe," he said at last, "that the widow was not the only one to visit Mr. Yates in the days leading up to his death. That perfume, one of a very distinct origin, tells me a story, but it is not yet the whole story." I stood still, processing what he had said. "You think someone else was involved with Yates?" Poirot gave a slight nod, though his face remained impassive. "Perhaps not involved in the way you may imagine, but involved all the same. The presence of that scent indicates something hidden. A relationship, perhaps, that was not known to
the others? A lover's scent? Or simply someone who wished to remain in the shadows? The questions were mounting in my mind, and I found myself at a loss for answers. Who else could it be, Poirot?
Poirot's gaze shifted toward the corridor again, and he gave a quiet sigh, as though already bored with speculation. "For now, we observe, Hastings. We let the pieces fall into place on their own. But remember, my friend, the truth is often
found not in the loudest voices, but in the whispers between them."
I was about to speak again when a sharp cry broke the quiet. Michael Yates had just stormed into the corridor, his face contorted in frustration. "Where is he?" Michael demanded, his voice rising. "Why is no one telling me what happened?"
"To my father? He said he would die at midnight. What's going on here?" The tension had broken in an instant, and all eyes turned to Michael.
Yet, in that brief moment, Poirot's expression remained unchanged. He said nothing, only nodded once, as if confirming some quiet deduction to himself. I had no idea what was unfolding, but one thing was certain. This mystery was far from over. Bixie's drawing room at St. Andrew's Hospital was cold, though not from the chill of the air. It was the kind of cold that settles when secrets are kept too long, when too many eyes glance sideways, avoiding what ought to be looked at head-on. The tension from the events surrounding Mr. Yates's death had lingered, thick as fog, making the air heavy and difficult to breathe. It was in this atmosphere that Poirot, with his customary quiet authority, began his first series of interviews. I followed close behind, a silent observer, as Poirot led us first to Dr. Motley's office. The doctor was sitting behind his desk, his fingers drumming nervously on the smooth surface of the polished wood. His face, though outwardly calm, betrayed an edge of agitation. He greeted Poirot with a quick, almost forced smile, his eyes darting toward me before settling back on the detective. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, you honor me with your presence," Dr. Motley said, his voice a touch too smooth. "I trust you've been informed of the peculiar circumstances surrounding Mr. Yates's death?" Poirot's eyes studied him with a piercing intensity. "Indeed, Dr. Motley. It is said that Mr. Yates knew the time of his death. Is that so?" Dr. Motley leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "Mr. Yates was eccentric. I have no reason to doubt his belief that he would die at midnight. But, as you know, Poirot, people often cling to strange notions at the end of their lives. It was a coincidence, nothing more." Poirot did not respond immediately, but his gaze never left the doctor. "A coincidence, you say? And yet you did not think it peculiar that he was so certain?" Dr. Motley's hand faltered for a moment, and he cleared his throat. "People react differently to death, Monsieur Poirot. Some believe in omens, others in fate. Mr. Yates was prone to exaggeration. He was not a man who could be taken at face value. Poirot nodded slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against his chin as he absorbed the doctor's words. I see, and his health, it was satisfactory? No reason for alarm beyond his eccentricity? Dr. Motley hesitated. His health was deteriorating, but not to the extent that would suggest a sudden death. It was a natural decline. Poirot studied him, his expression soft but intent. And yet, he died at precisely
midnight. A natural coincidence, as you say. Dr. Motley's eyes narrowed slightly, though he quickly regained his composure.
Yes, it must have been. Poirot's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, though there was no humour in it. Very well, we shall see. You may go, Doctor, but I would ask you to remain available should I have further questions. To Motley stood, a little too hastily, and made his way to the door. As he passed by us, his eyes flickered nervously again, a fleeting moment of doubt that Poirot, of course, caught. With a subtle nod, Dr. Motley left the room, and Poirot turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you observe Hastings?" he murmured almost to himself. "The doctor, he protests too much. A man who is certain of his actions would not tremble so. We will see." The next interview was with Yates's children, Emily and Richard. Emily, the eldest, sat rigidly in a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was a woman in her early 30s with sharp features and a cool, composed demeanour. Richard, on the other hand, was a younger man in his late 20s, with a face that was less refined and more troubled. His eyes darted nervously around the room, as though seeking something to anchor his thoughts. Poirot wasted no time. "Monsieur Richard, Mademoiselle Emily, I must ask you to tell me about your father. What was he like in his final days?" Emily spoke first, her voice smooth but without warmth. "Father was always difficult. He believed that he was invincible. Even as his health deteriorated, he spoke often of his own demise, but we did not take him seriously. It was just part of his eccentricity." Richard, however, was more agitated. His face flushed as he spoke, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think it was eccentricity?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "Do you know what he said to me the day before? He told me that the business was failing, that I was too reckless. We argued. I lost my temper. I don't know what happened after that. But I know this much. He was about to cut me out of the will. He was going to leave me nothing, and I couldn't bear it." Poirot's gaze hardened, and I noticed a subtle change in his posture. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, as he studied Richard. "You had a quarrel over the business, you say? And you feared your inheritance would be threatened?" Richard's breath hitched, and for a moment I thought he might collapse under the weight of his own guilt. "Yes," he admitted, his voice low. "But I didn't kill him, I swear I didn't." Poirot remained silent for a long moment, allowing the words to sink in. Richard's confession was raw, emotional, but there was something about it that felt forced. It didn't ring entirely true. Poirot, I noticed, didn't seem convinced. "Tell me, Monsieur Richard," Poirot said at last, his voice calm but firm. "If your father was truly about to cut you out of the will, why would he have waited until that night to do so? And why would he have told you that? Was he taunting you?" Richard's face contorted. "I don't know, I don't understand, but I know he was angry. He was angry at me for everything, at the way I ran the business, the way I lived my life." He looked up at Poirot, his eyes pleading. "I didn't kill him, I swear." Poirot gave a slight nod, but his eyes were still hard, calculating. I will reserve judgment for now, Monsieur Richard. But remember this, anger alone does not kill. There is something more at play here, something deeper. As Richard left the room, Poirot turned his attention to Emily. She had said nothing during her brother's outburst, but now she looked up at Poirot, her eyes cold and impassive. "I'm afraid my brother's emotions tend to get the better of him," she said quietly, almost as an afterthought. "He always was the dramatic one. As for my father, I didn't know him well. He was distant, but I don't think his death was anything more than a coincidence." Poirot studied her closely, his eyes flicking to her hands, which were still
tightly clasped in her lap. There was no sign of distress, no hint of grief, just control. "You did not care for your father, mademoiselle?"
Poirot asked, his tone gentle. Emily's lips twitched slightly, though I could detect no real emotion in her voice. "I didn't hate him, if that's what you mean. But I did not mourn his passing. Perhaps it is... Well, you see, I was prepared for it." Poirot didn't respond immediately, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "I see," he said at last. "Thank you, mademoiselle. I will speak with you again if necessary." As we left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Both Richard and Emily had their own versions of events, but neither seemed entirely trustworthy. The emotional distance between them, especially Emily's detachment, left me uneasy. Could it be possible that the death of Mr. Yates was not simply the result of his eccentric predictions? Poirot, as usual, said little, but I saw his mind working. We had only begun to scratch the surface, but I felt the case growing more complicated with every passing minute. We made our way to the next room, but Poirot's eyes were distant, as though contemplating something far beyond what had been said. I knew then that we were not finished. The pieces were not yet in place. The days since Mr. Yates's death had been strangely silent, punctuated only by small, unsettling discoveries. We had met with more suspects, examined their behavior, and found ourselves entangled in contradictions and misdirections. But for all our observations, we had yet to find the one thing that could bring clarity to the case. It was the letter, I realized, that would be the key. The sealed envelope left behind on Yates's nightstand had been a curiosity since the moment we first laid eyes on it. Poirot had avoided it for days, his sharp eyes noting every detail, but never revealing the slightest hint of what he suspected. Today, however, we found ourselves alone in the study of St. Andrew's Hospital, where the letter now lay between us. Poirot's gloved hands, pristine and deliberate, took hold of the small envelope, inspecting the delicate paper and the elegant script that adorned its surface. The letter inside had not been opened since Yates's death. No one had dared to breach it, even the police. It was as though they feared the answers it might provide. "Here it is, Hastings," Poirot said quietly, his voice almost reverent. "The one who will understand." I leaned in slightly, my curiosity piqued. "But who is this addressed to, Poirot? Who could Mr. Yates have meant?" Poirot did not answer immediately, instead turning the envelope over in his hands as though weighing something invisible. "You see, my friend," he murmured, "this letter is no ordinary missive. Yates, he knew what was coming." His fingers gently pried open the seal, and I held my breath as he withdrew the letter, unfolding it with the same careful precision with which he handled every detail of the case. The handwriting was elegant, a flowing script that could only belong to someone accustomed to refined tastes. The words were sharp, almost accusing, yet imbued with a sense of personal guilt. Poirot's lips barely moved as he read the contents silently. His eyes scanned the page twice, then thrice, before he placed the letter down on the table. He waited long enough. "Well?" I asked, unable to bear the suspense. Poirot glanced at me, his gaze calculating. "Yeats's words. They are full of confession, Hastings. He speaks of a past indiscretion, a debt of guilt he could not outrun. He says he was being blackmailed. He admits to wronging someone long ago, and that this person has now returned to collect what was owed." I blinked, taking in his words. Blackmailed? But who could it be? And why? Poirot's lips curled into his small, inscrutable smile. "Ah, that is the question, is it not? And one we shall answer, in time." The letter was, as Poirot had said, a confession of sorts. Mr. Yates wrote about a past indiscretion that seemed to gnaw at him until the very end. He hinted at some sort of threat, a threat that had followed him for years, patiently waiting until the right moment to strike. Yet the identity of the blackmailer remained unclear. Yates had left behind a trail of clues, but they were scattered, enigmatic. There was no clear name, no direct accusation. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning. The letter again, Poirot. Could this person be one of the suspects? Could someone here have known Yates's secret? Poirot folded his arms across his chest, his gaze fixed on the letter, deep in thought. "It is not so simple, my friend. We must be careful. To follow the scent of this blackmailer too eagerly could lead us astray. It may be a trap, a deliberate misdirection, but—" He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But I believe we are getting closer. The atmosphere here at St. Andrews, this unease, it is not merely the result of an ordinary death. There is something else at work, something far more personal." I considered his words carefully. "Do you think the blackmailer was here at the hospital? Or could it have been someone outside?" Poirot smiled slightly, but his eyes were still distant, focused on some invisible point. "Both possibilities are worth considering, Hastings, but I suspect that whoever it is, they are very close, closer than we think." With a deft motion, Poirot folded the letter and placed it carefully back into the envelope, sealing it once, again. "We will keep this in mind, but we will not make haste. First, we must observe. We must wait. The truth will reveal itself, as it always does." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Yates' final words hanging between us. My mind raced with questions, and yet I could not shake the nagging sense that something crucial was being kept from us, something hidden just out of sight. "What's next, Poirot?" I asked, my voice betraying the unease that was growing within me. "How do we move forward?" Poirot rose from his chair with his usual fluid grace, the sharp lines of his figure casting a long shadow in the low light. "Next, we speak with those who were closest to Mr. Yates, his widow, his children, those who might have known of his guilt. And we observe, Hastings, we observe closely, for, as always, the truth is in the details." We left the study, and, as we made our way down the corridor, I could sense the subtle shift in Poirot's demeanour. The mystery was thickening, like fog creeping in around us. The blackmailer, whoever they were, had left a trail that was now our task to follow. Felt a prickling on the back of my neck, the same sensation one gets when something important is just beyond reach. Poirot, ever the master of observation, had already started to formulate a plan in his mind. His calm, collected demeanour was unwavering, but I could sense that beneath the surface he was moving rapidly toward a conclusion. As we approached the next door, the widow's room, Poirot paused, his hand resting lightly on the doorknob. "Hastings, We may learn more from the widow than we expect, but remember this. People's emotions are often the most telling when they least want them to be. Before I could reply, Poirot had opened the door, and we stepped inside. The widow, Mrs. Yates, was sitting by the window, her face half hidden in shadow. There was something about the way she sat, so still, that made my stomach tighten. I couldn't help but wonder, was it grief that weighed on her, or something far darker? Poirot's eyes flickered toward her, and I saw him make his first silent deduction. The game, I realized, was truly afoot. The tension in the air had grown thicker since our last conversation with Mrs. Clara Yates. Poirot had kept his observations to himself. But there was an unmistakable quiet calculation in his manner. As we left her room, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in her demeanor, something beneath the surface, that didn't quite match the grief she professed. It was as though the mourning was a little too practiced, the sobs just a touch too rehearsed. Poirot was already deep in thought, his mind no doubt sifting through the scattered clues, like a master chess player preparing for his next move. We walked in silence for a while, the creak of the wooden floors beneath us punctuating the stillness. At last, Poirot spoke, his voice low, almost to himself. "There is something, Hastings. Mrs. Yates, Clara, she is a puzzle. One can see her distress, yes, but I wonder whether it is entirely genuine. She hides something from us." I nodded, unsure of what to make of his words. "You think she's faking her grief?" Poirot's eyes flickered, just briefly, to me. "Not faking, no, but perhaps she has learned the art of concealing her true emotions. She is more than she appears, this widow." Before I could ask for clarification, Poirot motioned for us to continue our investigation. He knew that we had to understand the emotional histories of all those involved, for that was where the true story always lay. Our next stop was Richard and Emily Yates, the children of the deceased. We found them sitting together in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones. Richard, as always, looked detached, his sharp features betraying none of the emotional weight one might expect from a son whose father had just died. Emily, on the other hand, seemed more visibly affected, but there was something in her eyes that seemed to speak of a deeper sorrow, something she wasn't yet ready to reveal. Poirot, never one to waste an opportunity, turned his attention to them immediately. "Might I have a word with you both?" he asked, his voice soft but commanding. Richard, as expected, gave a curt nod, while Emily hesitated before following suit. We led them to a nearby sitting room, and Poirot sat across from them, his eyes flicking between the two siblings as he began his line of questioning. "Tell me, mon ami, about your father, your relationship with him." Richard's gaze hardened ever so slightly, but his response was cool and measured. "My father and I had our differences, yes, but who doesn't? He was a businessman, and he expected a great deal from me. I always felt he could have done more for me, provided more support for my ventures. But that's all water under the bridge now, isn't it?" Poirot nodded thoughtfully, but I could see the slight tension in his posture, the way his fingers steepled together in thought. "And what of you, Mademoiselle Emily?" he asked, his tone softening. "Was your relationship with your father
As strained as your brother's?" Emily hesitated, her lips trembling for just a second before she composed herself. I didn't always understand him," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But he was my father, and I loved him. I think
he was afraid of growing old, afraid that everything he worked for would slip through his fingers." Poirot observed her carefully, his eyes narrowing just slightly. There was an underlying tension in her words, a hidden emotion that didn't quite match her measured calm. Something was at odds with her grief too, though not in the same way as her mother's. I glanced between them, my mind racing with possibilities. There was something familiar about this family dynamic, a subtle resentment, a long-buried bitterness. But there was more to uncover, and I knew that Poirot would find the answers in the spaces between their words. After a moment, Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Your father's business dealings?" he asked, his voice now taking on a more probing tone. "Did he ever speak of his financial troubles, his concerns about the future?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Father was always worried about money," he said, his eyes flickering toward Emily. "But he refused to ask for help, even when it was clear he needed it." "He was too proud," Emily added, her voice
almost too calm. "He was difficult, yes, but not a criminal." Poirot studied their faces for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of their words. He had heard the strained notes of truth within their statements, but there was more to it.
Their accounts of Yates' financial problems seemed genuine. Richard's anger at being denied support, Emily's sense of abandonment, but I couldn't help but feel there was a deeper rift, one that went beyond mere money. Poirot was already moving on, as always, his mind quick to absorb the smallest details. "And your mother?" he began again, turning his attention back to Emily. "Has she always been so devoted to your father?" Emily shifted, her expression flickering for just a moment before she regained control. "Mother has always been a complex woman. She loved him, but she was never happy, I think. She married him because it was expected."
Of her. At this, Poirot's expression seemed to sharpen. His eyes turned toward Emily with an intensity that made her squirm in her seat.
"And yet, mademoiselle, you did not seem surprised by your father's death. You were calm, almost too calm." Emily's mouth tightened, but before she could respond, Richard interrupted. "You're twisting her words," he said abruptly, his voice cold. "Emily's just upset, that's all." Poirot raised a hand, signalling for peace. "I am not accusing anyone, Monsieur Richard," he said smoothly. "But I observe. I ask questions. It is my way." Richard stiffened, but Emily, looking uncomfortable, stood up abruptly. "I think that's enough for today," she said, her voice uncharacteristically firm. "We've answered your questions. Now, if you'll excuse us." Poirot made no immediate move to leave. Instead, he watched them both carefully, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Of course," he said, with a small nod. "But we are not finished, not yet." As we left the room, I felt the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. The Yates family was indeed a complex web of emotions, resentments, and hidden motives. But one thing was clear. Each person was hiding something. Poirot's eyes were distant as we walked, his mind clearly at work. I had no doubt that beneath his quiet exterior he was already piecing together the fragments of the story. But there was something else in the air, something I could not yet put my finger on, that told me the investigation was about to take a turn. In the distance I caught a glimpse of Clara Yates moving swiftly down the hall with something clenched tightly in her hand. For a moment I thought I saw her slip something into a drawer before she disappeared behind a closed door. Poirot's gaze followed her movement, his expression unreadable. "There, Hastings, we must find out what she is hiding." With that, we made our way toward her, knowing that the answers we sought were closer than ever. But the more we uncovered, the more the mystery deepened. And I had the distinct feeling that Clara Yates's secrets were about to unravel. The atmosphere in the Hospital had shifted since our last conversation. What had been a slow simmer of suspicion had now become a bubbling cauldron of distrust. Word had spread quickly about the nature of Yates's death, and the air was thick with whispers. But it wasn't just the family members who seemed on edge now. No, the hospital staff had begun to turn on one another as well, their voices rising and falling in hurried exchanges, accusations flying like darts at an unseen target. Poirot had been unusually silent that morning, his mind clearly occupied with the latest development. Mrs. Clara Yates had proven herself to be an enigma, one that seemed both vulnerable and guarded in the same breath. Her grief was impossible to ignore, yet Poirot's observations told him there was more beneath the surface than she let on. And then, of course, there was the strange letter we had found, a possible clue to the past that hinted at a darker undercurrent to Yates' life. But as we arrived at the small office tucked away near the back of the hospital, a place where Poirot had arranged to meet Detective Harris, a local investigator, I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. Harris was a stout, middle-aged man with a weathered face and an air of disquiet about him, and when he rose from his desk to greet us, I noticed his eyes were wide with an unsettling mixture of urgency and uncertainty. "Poirot," he began, his voice lower than usual, "I need to speak with you. It's about Yates. There's something you should know." Poirot inclined his head, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he said nothing, allowing Harris to continue. "I've been looking into his business dealings. It's not something I've been able to confirm fully, but it's enough to raise serious questions," Harris continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as though afraid of being overheard. "Yates was involved in some shady corporate dealings. We've been hearing rumors for months that he was mixed up in a potential scandal.
One that could have cost him his reputation, his freedom, maybe even his life." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. For a moment I could see Poirot's eyes flicker with interest, but his expression remained inscrutable. "A scandal?"
Poirot repeated, his voice calm but sharp. "What sort of scandal are we speaking of exactly?" Harris took a deep breath, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something akin to fear cross his face. There were reports of embezzlement, fraud. Yates had been funneling money into questionable ventures, the sort of thing that could ruin a man in this town. He hesitated, then added, "Some say Yates was being blackmailed. Someone knew what he'd been doing, and they were threatening to expose him. It's possible that Yates was silenced before the truth could come out." I glanced at Poirot, watching his face carefully as Harris's words settled in the room. I could feel the weight of the suggestion pressing down on us. Was this the real motive behind Yates's death? Could it have been a corporate rival, or even one of his colleagues intent on preventing a scandal? Poirot, ever the expert in maintaining composure, remained perfectly still for a moment. I could see him weighing the possibility, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "No," Poirot finally said, breaking the silence. "I do not believe this. There is no doubt that Yates had secrets, Hastings, but I do not think his death was caused by some business dispute. This is an overreaction, an attempt to place the blame on something external. There is more at play here than corporate scandal." Harris looked at Poirot, stunned. "But surely," Poirot raised a hand, silencing him with a gentle but firm gesture. "Surely nothing, let us be clear. A man who lives in the shadow of blackmail does not die so quietly. Yates would not have allowed such a matter to be resolved with murder. No, this is something else, and I shall find it." As Poirot spoke, I could see Harris beginning to withdraw slightly, a look of disappointment creeping into his expression. But before either of us could say more, the door to the office creaked open, and in walked Dr. Motley, looking as flustered as ever. "I beg your pardon," Motley said, his voice tinged with agitation. "But there's something I must ask. I've just overheard some disturbing conversations among the staff. It seems some are beginning to wonder if there's more to Yates' death than simply a natural passing. There are rumors now that perhaps it wasn't the treatment he received, but something else entirely. Something malicious." Poirot raised an eyebrow at the sudden interruption. "Malicious, you say? Tell me, Dr. Motley, what are these rumors?" Motley shifted his weight nervously. "There's talk of sabotage, that perhaps someone within the hospital is responsible for Yates's condition. It's not just the staff. The patients are beginning to talk. People are scared. Someone's spreading the idea that the death was orchestrated." I could feel the air growing colder as the words sunk in. Hospital employees, already on edge after Yates's death, were now turning on one another. In this tense atmosphere, mistrust seemed to reign supreme. And as Dr. Motley left us, the scene in the hospital felt darker, more dangerous. Each passing moment seemed to carry with it the potential for another accusation, another breakdown of relationships. Poirot, however, was unruffled. His face remained as calm as ever, though I could see his mind working behind his placid expression. He turned to me, his eyes gleaming with the slightest hint of amusement. "You see, Hastings, this is what happens when people's nerves begin to unravel. Each person will reach for something to blame. First, it is business. Now, it is the hospital. But the truth is never so simple. No one here knows exactly what
happened to Yates. Not yet." His voice grew quieter as he turned away, heading toward the door. "But I will find out, Hastings, and I will find out quickly. We are getting closer now. Each thread, each clue takes us one step further, and
what we discover next may change everything." As we walked through the hospital corridors, the weight of Poirot's words settled heavily on me. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't just the staff who were feeling it. The patients, the family members, everyone seemed to be hiding something, even if they didn't know it themselves. The idea that Yates had been silenced to protect a business secret lingered in the back of my mind, a quiet echo of doubt. But Poirot's conviction that there was more to it than a corporate conspiracy was enough to keep me from entertaining that thought for too long. And yet, even as we left the office, I couldn't help but wonder, what if the detective was right? What if Yates' death was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that no one had yet fully grasped? As Poirot and I continued down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, eyes following us from hidden corners, whispers just out of reach. It was only a matter of time before someone's carefully constructed facade would crumble, revealing the truth. But for now, the mystery of Yates's death remained unsolved, and with each passing moment it seemed to grow more tangled than ever. The day after our unsettling meeting with Detective Harris, the mood in the hospital had shifted again. The whispers had quieted, replaced by a sense of palpable tension. Even the air seemed to press heavily against us, thick with suspicion. Yet, despite the growing unease, Poirot remained as composed as ever. It was clear from the look in his eyes that he was piecing together something far more intricate than anyone had realized. As we made our way through the crowded hallway, Poirot's pace was unhurried, almost as if he were letting the pieces of the puzzle fall into place at their
own speed.
We had already gathered a wealth of information, but it was still unclear which direction the truth would emerge from. Then, in the midst of it all, came the discovery that would force everything to shift. Clara Yates had been unusually silent. Since her husband's death, her demeanor still painted with grief. But Poirot's suspicion had never quite wavered. He had seen the cracks in her grief-stricken facade. And as we stood in the corridor discussing the potential ramifications of the business scandal that might have led to Yates's death, I overheard a conversation that would bring everything into focus. Martin Kane. That name, which had lingered in the background like an unresolved note, suddenly took on a sharper, more dangerous edge. Clara's former lover, whom I had initially believed to be nothing more than a remnant of her past, had now resurfaced with alarming regularity. He had been coming and going under the guise of an investigator, offering his help while simultaneously remaining at arm's length from the other suspects. But Poirot, ever attentive to the details, had not been content with the simple answers provided. It was then that we were approached by a member of the staff, her face pale with concern. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, as though unsure.
Whether her words would be believed, I think you should know something, Monsieur Poirot. I overheard something in the staff room. Martin Kane, he's not who he says he is.
Poirot turned slowly toward the woman, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Not who he says he is. Explain yourself, please. The woman swallowed hard. I don't know all the details, but it seems Kane has been using a false name. Someone overheard him on the phone speaking in a manner that didn't match his supposed role as an investigator. He was making threats to someone, I don't know who, but it sounded like he was part of something bigger, something more dangerous than just a man looking for answers. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as the full implication of what the woman had said sank in. Poirot, though, was unshaken. He thanked her, his face as calm as ever, but I could see the intensity in his eyes as he processed the new piece of information.
Very well, Poirot said softly, turning back to me. This changes things. It seems Martin Kane has been playing a role much larger than a mere bystander in this affair. We must find out who he really is and what he wants. For this new information
suggests that he has an agenda, one that may be closely tied to Yates's death. We wasted no time. Poirot had already formulated a plan, his mind moving quickly as he set about tracing Kane's true identity. I found myself swept up in the tide of Poirot's reasoning, his methodical steps clearing the fog of confusion that had clouded my mind for days. As we approached the office where Kane had been last seen, Poirot's presence seemed to fill the space, his authority undeniable. Kane's reaction when we confronted him was predictable, a flash of surprise, followed by a quick, defensive retort. He denied everything as expected, but the lies were thin like smoke escaping through the cracks of a wall. "I don't know what you're insinuating, Monsieur Poirot," Kane said, his voice faltering for just a moment. "I'm only here to help Clara, to find out who did this to her husband," but Poirot was not fooled. He pressed him harder, asking pointed questions that made Kane squirm beneath the weight of his own words. "Help her? Or is it that you have a different interest in the situation, Mr. Kane? I believe you know more than you are letting on." Kane's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Guilt? Something darker, perhaps. But then he quickly masked it, leaning back in his chair with an air of false bravado. "I've already told you everything I know. I'm not hiding anything." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Your name is not Martin Kane, is it?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "That is an alias, one that you have been using for reasons I have yet to determine. But I shall, Mr. Kane. And once I do, you will have much to explain." Kane's face grew pale, but he still denied everything. He swore that he had no part in Yates's death, but the more he spoke, the more inconsistencies began to surface. His alibi was flimsy, his story full of holes. Poirot listened, his mind already working to unravel the truth from the tangled web of lies. As we left the office, Poirot turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You see, Hastings, it is not only Clara Yates who has secrets to hide. Martin Kane, or whoever he truly is, has been playing a dangerous game. His involvement in this case runs deeper than we could have imagined." I could feel the weight of Poirot's words settle on me. Every instinct told me that Kane was hiding something vital, something that connected him to Yates's death, but the truth remained just out of reach. I could see it in Poirot's eyes. He was close, closer than ever, but not yet ready to reveal the full extent of his deductions. The revelations of the day had shaken the very foundations of the case, but they had also raised more questions than answers. What did Kane want? And how was he connected to the mysterious events that had led to Yates's death? As we moved on from the office, the tension in the hospital grew thicker still. I could feel the eyes of the other staff and patients following us, and I knew that Poirot was already calculating their reactions, passing out the smallest details that might lead to the final truth. But for now, I was left with a single, pressing thought. Who exactly was Martin Kane, and what was he really after? And as Poirot walked ahead of me, deep in thought, I knew that the answer, like the threads of a well-woven tapestry, was just beginning to unravel. The night after our confrontation with Martin Kane, the tension in the hospital had reached a boiling point. It wasn't just the fact that Kane's deception had been uncovered, it was the sense that every conversation, every glance, was weighted with suspicion. The walls themselves seemed to whisper of secrets and betrayal. Poirot, however, appeared as unfazed as ever, though I knew that behind his composed exterior, his mind was moving at a pace I could never match. It was just past midnight when the incident occurred. I had been in my room trying to make sense
of the mounting confusion when a knock at the door roused me from my thoughts. It was one of the hospital staff, pale and breathless.
"Mr. Hastings, have you seen Miss Emily? She's gone, disappeared. No one can find her." The words hit me with the force of a punch. Emily Yates, the daughter of the late Sir Edward Yates, the woman whose strained relationship with her father had already raised suspicions, had vanished without a trace. It seemed impossible. Yet the woman's fear was palpable, her panic contagious. I rushed to the Yates family's quarters, hoping against hope that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But as I arrived, Poirot was already there, quietly assessing the scene with his characteristic precision. He was calm, composed, his mind clearly at work, even as the staff buzzed nervously around him. "Mon ami," he said, his voice a whisper of reassurance amidst the turmoil. "It seems our puzzle grows more complex with every hour. It is not only Sir Edward Yates who has secrets. His daughter, too, has her mysteries." "Where is she?" I asked, looking around the empty room, my heart pounding. "Has anyone seen her?" Poirot did not answer immediately. His eyes scanned the room as though searching for an answer in the very air itself. It was only after a moment that he stepped toward the desk where Emily had been sitting earlier that day. There, beneath a stack of papers, was a small folded note. He picked it up with delicate fingers and held it out to me. "Here, Hastings, you should see this." The note was brief, but it chilled me to the bone. It read, "The hour of midnight is when the truth will come. Do not look for me. It is too late now." Poirot's brow furrowed as he read the words aloud. "How curious," he murmured, folding the paper back with care. "The hour of midnight. The hour suggests a specific moment, does it not? A prophecy, perhaps, or a final cryptic message. But from whom? Could it be a clue?" I asked, feeling the weight of the words settle over me. "Emily knew something, Poirot. She must have." Poirot's eyes met mine, and there was something in his gaze, a flicker of understanding, that I could not entirely comprehend. "Oui, Hastings, but it is not a clue that leads us to a person. It is a clock. The hour of midnight, and what that
signifies. But we must tread carefully. There is more at play here than simple disappearance. This is no random act. Just as he spoke, the hospital staff erupted into chaos. One of the nurses burst in, her face white as a sheet. "Dr. Motley, he's dead. Found in his office. But it's strange. He was locked in from the inside."
A collective gasp filled the room. Dr. Motley, the rather unassuming physician who had seemed so caught up in the web of hospital politics and personal grievances, was dead. But the details of his death made little sense. Locked in from the inside. How could that be? Poirot remained still for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through the possibilities. He glanced at the clock on the wall, a reminder of the hour. It had just struck 1. "Mon Dieu," Poirot muttered. "It is as I feared. Another life lost. But we must not let the panic cloud our judgment. Dr. Motley's death is no accident. This is all connected. The hour of midnight. And now a second."
Death. I tried to process the information, but the weight of it was staggering.
Emily had disappeared, leaving only a cryptic note behind, and now Dr. Motley was dead. What did it all mean? How did it tie into the prophecy Yates had spoken of before his death? Poirot stood still, his eyes narrowing with concentration, as he examined the facts one by one. He seemed to be piecing together a mental image of the events. A puzzle, yes, but a more dangerous one than any I had imagined. "We must consider everything, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice low, as if speaking more to himself than to me. "Yates's prophecy, the cryptic message from Emily, Dr. Motley's mysterious death. All these threads are tangled, but they will
unravel. We must remember that every detail, every piece of information is a part of the same intricate web. But what does it mean? I pressed, trying to make sense of it all. The hour of midnight.
That's what she meant in the note, isn't it? What does it have to do with Yates's death? And Motley's. Poirot's eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity as he turned toward me. "I will tell you this, Hastings. There is more to Yates's prophecy than meets the eye. The hour of midnight does not only refer to time, it is a symbol, a turning point, the moment when the truth is revealed." "But how can that be?" I asked, frustrated. "The truth is already slipping through our fingers." Poirot's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "No, my friend, the truth is not slipping away. It is simply waiting for us to recognize it." As he spoke, the clock on the wall struck 2 in the morning, and I could feel the weight of the
events closing in around us. Emily was still missing, the note still in my hand, and Dr. Motley's untimely death was just one more twist in a plot I had yet to fully understand.
The hospital was on edge, the staff afraid of what might come next. No one knew who to trust anymore, no one knew who the killer might be, and I, too, felt the pressure mounting. But Poirot remained calm, his eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that suggested he was already seeing the endgame even if none of us had arrived there yet.
"Time is running out," he said softly. "But we will find the answers, Hastings, one piece at a time." The words hung in the air as the clock ticked relentlessly toward an unknown conclusion. The hour had come. As I stood in the drawing room, surrounded
By the tension-soaked faces of those who had been suspects in the death of Sir Edward Yates, I could feel the weight of the moment settling over us. The door had been closed, the curtains drawn, and for the first time since the chaos began, Poirot seemed utterly composed. His eyes swept over the gathering of people, not a hint of doubt or fear in his gaze, only the sharp gleam of an intellect at work. There were only a few of us left now, the key players. Clara Yates, still a figure of delicate composure, though. Her eyes were shadowed with some deeper, unseen knowledge. Martin Kane, the former lover whose charade had fallen apart in the light of Poirot's scrutiny. The hospital staff, each now worn and nervous, their expressions betraying just how long they had lived in the grip of suspicion. And of course, Emily Yates, whose disappearance had been so oddly timed, and whose return had been equally mysterious. Poirot gave us no time to settle into our discomfort. "Mon ami, you may sit," he began, addressing the room in that steady, assured manner of his. "We have reached the end of this investigation, and now it is time for the truth. But I shall begin with a simple observation. Everyone in this room, each one of you has hidden something, and those hidden things, they have all led us here, to this moment." He paused, letting his words linger. I glanced around at the faces of those assembled. Clara was watching Poirot closely, her lips pressed tightly together. Kane, though silent, had a guarded expression, his eyes flicking nervously to the others. The staff shifted uncomfortably, as though bracing themselves for something they already
knew was coming. But it was Emily who had my attention. She seemed almost too calm, too composed.
Her eyes met Poirot's with a strange mixture of defiance and something darker, almost an admission. Poirot continued, his voice unhurried. "Sir Edward Yates, you see, did not die by chance. Nor was his death the result of some random accident, as some of you might have hoped. No, his death was carefully planned, orchestrated by someone who understood the complexities of human nature, someone who knew how to manipulate each of you, one by one." A ripple of unease spread through the room. I glanced at Poirot, and for the first time I saw his gaze shift, very briefly, almost imperceptibly, to Emily. But the shift was enough. My heart skipped a beat as I felt a dawning realization stirring in me. Poirot's eyes never left her as he spoke again. The key to the puzzle was not found in the envelope, nor the perfume, nor even in the many false identities some of you have presented. No, it was in the emotions that each of you tried so hard to hide: greed, revenge, and above all, the desperate desire for something more. He took a step forward, his voice lowering, becoming even more deliberate. "You see, Yates's prophecy was not about fate. It was a distraction, a clever lie. A lie told by one person in this room whose mind was already far ahead of the rest of us. It was not Yates who was the mastermind behind his death, but rather his own daughter, Emily." I felt a cold shock run through me as Poirot's words settled in the air. Emily? It made no sense. She had been the picture of grief at her father's passing. Yet now, standing before us all, the pieces began to fall into place. Poirot didn't wait for anyone to speak. "I will explain. You, Emily, used your father's mysterious death as a cover for your own ambitions.
You were not the helpless, innocent daughter we thought you were. You were the architect of this entire plot. The room fell utterly silent. Emily's face remained unreadable, but I saw her fingers twitch ever so slightly. A small, involuntary
movement that Poirot caught at once. "Let us go step by step," Poirot said. "First, the prophecy. When you discovered your father's illness, Emily, you realized something, a limited time for you to act.
You used that knowledge to manipulate those around you, most notably Dr. Motley, who was caught in your web of lies. You made sure to distance yourself from him, though, as he was, perhaps, the only one who knew too much. And yet, even Motley
Was fooled by your charm. He thought he was protecting you when in fact you were controlling him." Clara stirred, looking sharply at Emily, her face a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "But Emily, why? Why would you kill your father?" Emily's face hardened, the first hint of emotion breaking through the mask she had so carefully maintained. "It was always about the money," she said coldly. "The inheritance, the power. My father never believed in me. He always treated me like a child, never trusting me with the future of the family business. I had to take it from him, had to make sure the future would be mine, and when I saw the opportunity when he was sick and vulnerable, it was too perfect." Poirot nodded, as if everything had become clear to him. "The perfume. Do you remember the perfume, Hastings? A small detail, but significant. Emily, you made sure to leave traces of a scent that would be recognized by those who were close to Yates. You framed Clara's presence in the room, giving the impression that she was involved, while all the time you were the one moving behind. The scenes." Clara's face went pale, her lips trembling. "But I never touched him. I didn't even see him that day," she protested. Poirot continued undeterred. "That was the brilliance of your plan, Emily. You made sure to hide your tracks, to make sure no one would ever suspect you. It was a perfect cover, but you made one critical mistake. You underestimated the importance of the smallest details. You failed to anticipate that the prophecy, the hour of midnight, would give us the final clue. You, Emily, used your knowledge of your father's death to stage the scene, making it appear as though he had died in accordance with his own foretelling. But no one could predict what would happen when his death did not unfold the way you had imagined. That is why you panicked."
When Emily disappeared, I looked at Emily again, and for the first time I saw her for what she truly was.
The cool, calculating mind behind her father's death. Poirot smiled, the smile of a man who had won the game, though it was a smile tinged with sadness. "And now, Emily, you must face the consequences of your actions. For you are the true murderer. Here! And it was you who caused all the chaos that has unfolded in this hospital. No one else had the motive, the means, or the cold heart to carry out such a plan. It was you all along." Emily's expression faltered for just a second before it was replaced by a chilling calm. She had been caught. There was no way out now. "Yes," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. "It was me. And I would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for you." Poirot did not respond, merely nodding in acknowledgement of her confession, and, with that, the case was closed. The sound of the door closing behind Emily as she was led away by the police was final, almost deafening in its silence. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the room, a lingering presence that none of us could escape. Clara Yates stood motionless by the window, her face pale and her eyes distant. The promise of her father's inheritance, now a curse, had come. with the tragic weight of losing him in such a brutal, calculated manner. There were no tears left for her now, only a quiet acceptance of the harsh reality she had inherited, not just in terms of wealth, but the poison of family betrayal. Dr. Motley, standing nearby, shifted nervously. I could see that the release of his own burden had not come with relief, but with a profound, lingering sadness. His eyes met mine for a brief second, and in that look there was no joy in having been exonerated, no satisfaction, only a dull weariness. He, too, had become an unwilling player in a drama far beyond his understanding. Poirot, however, was the only one whose composure had not wavered. He had spoken the truth, and in doing so had closed the case. Yet there was something about him, a quiet sadness that now seemed to permeate his every movement. As I watched him, I could feel that the investigation was far from over for him. For Poirot, the case was never merely about solving the puzzle, it was about understanding the deeper currents of the human soul. He had already pieced together the intricate details of the plot, but I knew that his mind was far more concerned with what lay beneath the surface of the crime. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, I asked, almost hesitantly, "Poirot,
What now? The truth is out, but the consequences, they will be far-reaching." He looked at me then, his eyes sharp and filled with an expression that could only be described as a quiet melancholy.
"Mon ami," Poirot began, his voice as calm as ever. "You see, justice has been done. Emily will face the consequences of her actions, and the others will return to their lives. But what we must not forget, what is most important, is that human nature is complex, more so than any logic can account for." We walked in silence for a moment, the full moon casting long shadows across the gravel path. Poirot's words lingered in the air, and I found myself pondering them, though I could not grasp the full weight of their meaning. He continued, his voice low, almost contemplative. "You asked what now, Hastings, and I say that now we must reflect. For even though we solve the puzzle, it is not always the cleverest man who deceives, but the one who is most willing to believe in what he wishes to see. That was the true flaw here, not in Emily's plotting, but in the minds of those who wished to see her as something she was not." I thought back to the others, Clara, Dr. Motley, and how each had been so desperate to see the world through the lens of their own desires. Clara had been blinded by her love for her daughter and her guilt over her own actions. Dr. Motley had been consumed by his own fear of what his involvement might mean. Even I, in the early stages of the investigation, had been swayed by the surface appearances of the characters involved. Poirot stopped walking, his sharp gaze fixed on something far beyond the horizon. The case of Edward Yates was tragic, but it was not just about murder, it was about the desires, the hidden emotions, the things people are willing to do to protect themselves and what they want most. His voice softened, as if musing more to himself than to me. But in the end, the truth is always revealed, Hastings. Whether through logic, through observation, or in some cases through the simple unraveling of the lies we tell ourselves. That is the beauty and the terror of justice. It never falters, it is inevitable. I stood beside him, lost in thought. Poirot's words hung in the air, and for a moment I wondered if I would ever fully understand him. He had seen things in people that I, with all my years of friendship, had never noticed. He had read the signs, the subtle shifts in character, the faintest tremors of a lie. "It is a difficult thing to see the truth sometimes, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice almost a whisper. "We are all so eager to believe what we want to believe. We create our own truths, to protect us from the harshness of what is real. But in the end, the truth always finds its way to the surface. And when it does, it is always more painful than we expect. I nodded, not quite knowing how to respond. The weight of the case had settled in my chest, and I could feel the tiredness that came with having unravelled such a complex and tragic tale. It was the kind of case that left a permanent mark on the soul. We turned to leave the grounds of the Yates estate, the door to the investigation now closed, but the emotional toll of what had transpired would linger long after. As we reached the car, Poirot paused once more, his eyes tracing the stars above. Mon ami, justice is not always about what is fair.
It is not always about the cleverest plan or the most obvious solution. It is about understanding the truth beneath the lies, and sometimes it is the simplest of truths that are the most painful. He smiled, though it was a smile without joy.
But we must all live with it, and in time we move on. I followed him into the car, the door closing softly behind us. The case was over, and yet the shadows of its consequences would remain for far longer than I had anticipated. As the car pulled away from the Yates estate, I couldn't help but reflect on Poirot's words. The fragility of life, the ease with which we all deceive ourselves, the complexity of human nature, it was all too much to fully comprehend. But then again, perhaps that was the point. With Poirot by my side, I knew that the mysteries of the world would continue to unfold. One by one, the truths would be revealed, and we would face them, as we always did, together.